Okay, in this week's Weather Extra, we're looking ahead to early November when the entire world is going to come together once again for another talk on climate change. And this is a global issue. COP26, it's called the Conference of the Parties, COP, and it's the 26th time that the world will be coming together to try and come up with a plan that everybody can agree to and get real motivated on to start reducing our carbon emissions. And we're falling way behind goals already, but there's some optimism that people and nations, we're all going to start getting our act together. This will be the next global meeting. It's going to happen in the first 12 days of November. It's going to happen in Glasgow. It will be national news by the time we get there. But I want to localize a concern here at home. There are many concerns here at home. This is a global problem. We're all affected equally. But I think it helps to pick out just one issue where the item that's going to get discussed coming up in early November is going to have consequences for us here at home. And of course, the number one item is, how much can we reduce the projected warming of the Earth's climate? That's the goal. Of course, we do that by determining how we're going to stop putting so much carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. But the goals are then listed in degrees of warming. So here's just a little background. So far, we've warmed the planet on average 1 degree Celsius since 1900, since we really started getting into the Industrial Revolution and we started changing the Earth's climate. Doesn't sound like a lot, but 1 degree Celsius has been enough to cause the kinds of changes we're already seeing. So what are the stated goals from here? Well, the ultimate is to keep it to 1.5 degrees. That's the bottom line here, the projection going forward. That would be the creme de la creme. If we could do that, there'd be major celebrating. We'd still have issues, but we would have manageable issues if we could keep it to 1.5 degrees Celsius. On the other hand, where are we right now? In other words, what path are we on right now if we don't change anything? That top line, that's the path we're on. You can see the pandemic, we took a little bit of a dip, and then we went right back to business as usual. And as of right now, the current path takes us to warming that would be closer to about 2.9 degrees Celsius. In other words, almost twice as much as we've already done by the year 2100 if we changed nothing. So hopefully, and obviously, that's not going to happen. It'd be possible if we didn't change anything. But where we are with a more realistic goal now would be this middle line here. Maybe we can get it down to 2 degrees Celsius, more like 2.5 degrees Celsius at this point. If you take a look at what the US, Canada, European Union, and China, some of the bigger contributors, have put some real concrete promises on the table for how we're going to do this. Right now, that gets us to about, say, 2.4 degrees Celsius. That's still a big increase from where we are now. We're still going to have issues. Remember, the question is, are we keeping these issues manageable, or are we letting this be a runaway train and get totally out of hand? Let's bring it back home. What's the number one issue on the top of mind right now for us? Droughts and wildfire season. If you look at the summer so far for the western US, California, for June, July, and August, had its warmest summer on record. That was already in the headlines. Paul Hagen talked about that in his Weather Extra last week. It was kind of interesting the way it worked out, by the way, because if you look a little more closely, it was interior California that had its warmest June, July, and August on record ever. Near the coast, where the majority of us live, here in the Bay Area, down in LA, some spots were actually cooler than average because we had a strong onshore flow. But where it matters most, where the landscapes that are most vulnerable to high temperatures and the drying of the landscape are, the forests of the Sierra, that's where we saw our warmest summer on record. That's how you dry out the landscape, and that's what this summer did. Now, if we look at some of the projections for climate change here, going out through the next several decades, you can see an increasing pattern here. Heat waves per year, the duration in days, and the intensity, obviously all on the increase. That much we already know. Here's the latest science put together by NOAA. So you remember we started this conversation with the big meeting coming up in early November, where they've got their stated goals for what they'd like to do, what would be the ultimate, and maybe what the more likely scenario would be. We put that into a schematic which shows us, well, if we don't do anything, and if we stay on business as usual, that's the high emissions outcome over here. This shows you how much we're going to see a change in soil moisture and the drying of the landscape by the time we get to 2100. The deeper shades of brown right here show you a much more ominous scenario. That's if we did nothing. Even if we did the low emission scenario, we still need to prepare ourselves for the fact that the landscape is likely still going to experience drier summers. But again, the takeaway is, can we keep it within a manageable range? That's the goal. That's why we're trying to get that 1.5 degrees Celsius of warming, or maybe even 2 degrees Celsius if we can do it. With that in mind, if we look at what we've done for the last 20 years as far as the drought's concerned, we've been in what you could call a mega drought. This goes back all the way to the year 2000, and it shows you the condition, the state of drought on the landscape in California. It's color-coded. The deeper you get into the shades of red, the more extreme the drought is, the drier the landscape is. When you look at a 20-year snapshot, you can see there have been some short reprieves, but in general, it's been a 20-year drought with some breaks. And we're getting close now to the classifiable term of mega drought, which is a drought that lasts for 20 years or more. The concern within those mega droughts are, how intense are the most extreme drought years? We've had some big ones over the last few years. 1977 really stands out from the last century as a bad one, but we know this last winter was also pretty bad. And again, when we look at the differences for the comparison in terms of the possible scenarios, how much can we keep the planet warming? If we let it go to the high emission scenario, we can see a much higher likelihood that those extreme drought years are going to be a lot more common within these periods where we go through these long extended droughts. And that's really when you get into trouble with drought, when you go into the extreme years. If you look over here at the low emission scenario, we could still have some of those extreme years, but there shouldn't be as many of them. Sticking with this idea of climate change is here, we're already dealing with it. The question is, how bad do we want it to get? And how motivated do we want to get to make sure it doesn't get to those worst case scenarios? How manageable do we want to keep it? So as we approach early November, that's really what's on the table. And that's what the discussions are going to be about. And that's just one local tie-in for what will be a primary concern for us here at home, while the international community is making headlines on this discussion in early November. That's this week's Weather Extra edition. Paul Hagen will be in next week with another one.